Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Rachel Goldbrenner, the Executive Director of the Reese Center on Law and Security at NYU Law. And together with Just Security, we're happy to welcome you to this conversation about what's next for U.S. diplomacy and foreign assistance. We're convening today having just recently marked the first 100 days of the second Trump administration. Many of the developments during this period have important repercussions for national security. But today we wanted to focus specifically on foreign policy and on the administration's proposed reorganization of the State Department and USAID. The steps already undertaken and the proposals for the further revamping of American diplomacy and foreign aid are significant in their own right. And they're also happening at the same time as the world beyond our borders seems increasingly fractious, complex, and uncertain. So we thought it was important to convene a group of leading experts to help unpack what's actually being done and proposed. What of it may be new or different from the typical efforts of incoming administrations to streamline the bureaucracy and advance their own policy priorities, and what these changes may mean for US national security and the international community more broadly. So I couldn't think of a better group of speakers to take up this important topic. They have served at senior levels in the agencies, offices, and branches of government we'll be discussing across both regional and thematic functions. And they're also thoughtful analysts and deep thinkers about US leadership and foreign policy. And in that vein, I would commend you to their writings on these and other topics at justsecurity.org. Our moderator today will be Michael Hanna, a non-resident senior fellow here at the Reese Center and the U.S. Program Director at the International Crisis Group, where he leads the organization's research and policy prescriptions on U.S. foreign policy in conflict settings. Ambassador Dan Freed is currently the Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Over a 40-year career in the Foreign Service across both Republican and Democratic administrations, he has served in many senior roles, including Ambassador to Poland, Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, State Department Coordinator for Sanctions Policy, and Special Envoy for Guantanamo closure. Dr. Daphna Rand served most recently as the Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Prior to that, she was the Director of the Office of Foreign Assistance at the department, where she oversaw $70 billion in annual U.S. foreign aid. In roles outside of government, her writing and research have focused on international security and democratic reform, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa. And Michael Schiffer was most recently the Assistant Administrator of the Bureau for Asia at USAID. Prior to that, he was Senior Advisor and Counselor on the Democratic staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's also served in the Pentagon as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia and outside of government at a variety of think tanks and foundations. So this is a really preeminent group to learn from about these fast-moving developments and their implications. We're really grateful to our speakers for your time and expertise, and also thank you to all of you for joining us for this discussion. And with that, I will turn things over to you, Michael, to get started. So Michael Hanna.
Yes, sorry about that. Thanks, Rachel. It's great to be with this great group of panelists. I think where we'll start is to try to set the scene, and maybe Daphna, you can start us off here. A lot is proposed, but quite a bit of what this America First State Department is to look like is really unconfirmed. There's been a lot of speculation, much that is yet to be decided, much that might depend on Congress. But maybe if you could start us off with just a sort of setting of the scene of what we think we know. It does look like there's a kind of more traditional approach to regional bureaus, perhaps, and some restructuring, particularly with the functional bureaus. But where are things at the moment? Because they really do appear kind of muddled and unclear.
Thanks so much. And thanks, Rachel and Michael and the NYU folks for convening us on the timely topic. Before we start answering this highly analytical question, which I appreciate because it is top of mind, I think it's important to start this conversation with an acknowledgement that the boxes on an org chart really do refer to hundreds and in some cases thousands of public servants. And so many individuals' professional and personal lives are caught up in this reorg that I think it's important to all of us have worked with individuals who are now either being fired or, have the uncertainty of being let go. So I do think that's an important caveat, and we should keep that first and foremost in mind. In terms of the overall reorg, I think the overall sentiment that I'm hearing, and I think this is true, is that it is still up to debate from day to day how this is going to work. It's clear that the ambition from the top of the State Department was to quote unquote reduce the redundancies. And that seems like a noble goal. It is true that there are all kinds of functions that duplicate across the State Department. And so there is an effort. And so if that's true, and if the effort is really to reduce the inefficiencies and reduce the clearance, the famous clearance process, then that is noble. More worrisome is the contraction and diminution in the parts of the policymaking process that represent US leadership, US global engagement, US soft power, to quote our beloved and recently deceased Joe Nye, and all facets of America's interaction with the world that anyone serving any place overseas understands is fundamental to the art of diplomacy and foreign policy. And even if the folks at the embassy are doing sort of Kissingerian high level diplomacy, or even working on, for example, security assistance and helping get contracts for American companies, whether in the defense sector or other sectors, every single individual is also working on the so-called soft power. Everyone is working on improving rule of law and governance and even human rights all around the world. That is just a component of what folks do, and it is interconnected. So the most worrisome theme so far is that the Washington reorg seems to really diminish or not recognize how integrated those functions are into the day and day of a diplomat's job, and frankly, all across all of our foreign policy challenges that we have right now.
So, Dafa, you mentioned potential benefits. And so let's start off with the sort of optimist take then. Ambassador Freed, Michael, what's your sense of what some potential benefits might look like? I mean, I'm sure we're going to get into some more of the criticisms, but in your estimation, are there ways in which this could really enhance effectiveness, reduce redundancies, make for a more efficient department if implemented effectively?
Sure. That is, pruning a lot of single issue offices that often spring up in response to some lobbying group or some constituency can be a good thing. They can be pruned. That's not going to make a major difference. It'll make a marginal one, but marginal differences add up. I'm not against that. That's good. The reorganization seems to emphasize the centrality of the regional bureaus. I think that's actually good. Regional bureaus tend to keep a strategic view in mind. The reorganization preserves Daphne Rand's former bureau, the Human Rights Bureau. That is critical. I remember when that was introduced during the Carter administration and was treated with disdain by the foreign policy establishment. It turned out to be that bureau should be preserved and strengthened, and a lot of the offices likely to be eliminated could have their functions picked up by DRL without a loss of efficiency. So those parts of the reorganization could be fine. And, Michael Shiver pointed that out in his article. Where it gets problematic is U.S. assistance, and that's just left blank. It's not clear where that fits in. And the administration's other crusade to take down the radio stations, not part of state, but part of U.S. foreign policy, destroy RFERL, Voice of America, Radio Marti, Radio Free Asia. That speaks to, what did Daphne say, a neo-Kissingerian view. To be precise about what that means, Kissinger had little use for dissidents. Okay? He thought they were especially in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, they were a waste of time or destabilizing if they had any impact at all. But in no case were they useful to American interests. A colossal error, because the Iron Curtain toppled largely as a result of pro-democracy dissidents in the communist world, the people that were dismissed by Kissinger, who turned out to be critical. And I mention this because one of the central tenets of the Trump administration is that pursuit of values or democracy, or as Trump said, seeing the souls of leaders or something like that, is not an American interest. Well, winning the Cold War was kind of an American interest, and we would not have done so except for the democratic dissidents and our support for those dissidents. A second area, maybe related, is the incomprehensible destruction of the State Department's tools to combat foreign propaganda, aka disinformation, aka foreign, foreign interference, foreign information, and manipulation and interference. They have destroyed the Global Engagement Center, which had its faults, but it was beginning to find its feet. And they are trying to take down other instruments throughout the US government to combat foreign disinformation. I don't know, seems to me that if you are in a world of great power competition and you have the Chinese communists and Putin and Iranian propaganda, you want to be able to blunt its impact and not surrender to the field to the bad guys. So there are some deeply problematic elements of what the Trump administration is doing, but the reorganization itself could work out. As for the structure of foreign assistance, well, Michael Schiffer knows more about this than I do. It just strikes me that foreign service officers don't have the expertise to run big assistance programs. Sending this stuff to the regional bureaus could work, but you're going to need some of the capacity the AID had and foreign service officers do not have to make it work. Okay, gone on long enough, and I hope I was helpful. I'll get off my soapbox.
Yeah, Michael, maybe turn to you on this then.
Yeah, I would not hold myself as knowing more about anything than Ambassador Fried on any issue, but nonetheless, just to sort of maybe try to embroider a little bit on his comments. Look, absolutely agree that there are opportunities for greater efficiency and better alignment in how we conduct our foreign policy and our foreign assistance. And I would hazard a guess that if you asked Daphna, if you asked Dan, if you asked me to nominate programs that were less than well aligned or less than perfect in their execution, we could all come up with a list of things that we would like to see realigned out of existence. So that the broad thrust of the undertaking, not at all problematic. And secondly, I would offer that the world that we live in today in 2025, and this gets to some of Ambassador Fried's points about the return of an era of great power strategic competition, or whatever it is that we're calling things today, right? That's a different world than the world in which AID was created. It's a different world than the world in which the statutory authorities that enmeshed AID or that created and drove for DRL existed in. So a blank sheet of paper exercise to make sure that from the bottom up, that the institutions and mechanisms that we have for the conduct of our foreign policy and development diplomacy actually align with the realities of the world. Also a good idea. The problem is that, you know, the way in which this has been pursued so far has been completely and utterly astrategic, right? It's been driven not by an assessment, you know, and Daphne and Dan got at this, of the functions and capabilities that we need and that we want to be able to preserve or indeed strengthen, given the challenges that we face. It was driven by budget considerations, and I would offer complete and utter misunderstanding of what those budget considerations were. And so the build as we've seen it so far, and it keeps on changing, you know, every day, doesn't really seem to take into account those capabilities and capacities that we need to be able to preserve, maintain, and strengthen. Doesn't really take into account, and I agree with Ambassador Freed's point that sort of the alignment with regional bureaus may actually provide, you know, some additional strength and strategic guidance for the overall system, but doesn't seem to take into account, you know, the functions that we as a government need to be able to be successful in driving development diplomacy and driving our broader foreign policy and national security interests in the years ahead. I'm not quite sure how one reverse engineers things now that we're sort of in the middle of this process, right? Which is another issue and problem. You know, as we think about the many challenges that we have around the world right now, China, Russia, others, they're not waiting for us to get our realignment and reorganization done and then to start doing things, right? The world is moving. And by the time we get this sorted out, which isn't going to be September 30th, when in theory, Secretary Rubio will sign off on the reorganization plan, but will be a couple of years of, you know, moving offices and, as Daphne pointed out, moving people in their lives around. The world is going to have moved on, and we're going to have lost an absolutely critical period where we have effectively and needlessly placed ourselves on the sidelines to be able to drive issues. And that is going to be a huge cost of the way in which the administration has approached this undertaking. There was a way to do it right. I think we may be past the point of our ability to do it right. So I think we're playing right now to do it less wrong.
Yeah, maybe picking up there for all of you. I mean, you're talking about a world that is moving. You know, it's been described as a world between orders. There's been quite a bit of tumult. I think real speculation about the role of the United States in the world. And so I wonder what your assessment is about the real downside risks. What does it mean to be undertaking this major restructuring in this kind of environment? What are the things you're perhaps most concerned about? Whoever wants to take that first.
Okay. Look, there's no good time to do a reorganization. And the criticism that the world is moving too quickly for us to have that luxury can be made at any given moment. That doesn't bother me. And a capable bureaucrat, and I mean that as a compliment, can function well under any given set of circumstances if they know what they're doing. That doesn't bother me. It's not the reorganization per se. We're doing it, that's okay. What strikes me as problematic are some of the strategic assumptions that may lie under it. A massive resource cut, foreign assistance, and as I said, the inexplicable and nasty targeting of counter-disinformation efforts. Secretary Rubio was explicit and aggressive in his language, announcing the reorganization, going after the Global Engagement Center. Like, really? That may have been the cynical side of me said, well, his reorganization was not actually as radical as some of the earlier proposals. So in his place, I might also have covered it up with blowtorch rhetoric, but that's speculation. The fact is, the reorganization probably has to happen, and we could come out well. It's not even, as Michael Schiffer said, not even doing it less badly or as least bad as possible. You could have some marginal benefit to it. But the downside risks would be if we cut out essential functions and go back to a mid-1970s model where we didn't see the promotion of values as in our interests. And I want to give you an example of what I mean. One of Kissinger's post-Vietnam great strategic initiatives is now forgotten, but it was supposed to be dependence on regional strong leaders to carry the weight that the United States in a post-Vietnam era didn't think it could carry. And the premier example of a strong regional leader that we could count on as part of the Nixon Doctrine was the Shah of Iran. Now, that didn't turn out so well, did it? And if you had had a Human Rights Bureau, they probably wouldn't have stopped it, but they at least would have been whispering in people's ears saying, you better get a plan B because our contacts say he's not stable. But we weren't looking at that. Human rights was regarded as, a silly issue. It's actually strategic. And I say that not because I've ever worked in the Human Rights Bureau. I haven't. But I've seen what happens when foreign policy leaders think of the world as pieces on a chessboard and they think of themselves as Kissinger or Metternich or some such nonsense. And they think that the United States has no hard interest. Well, we do have a hard interest in not investing in regimes that are not stable. And a lot of the Reagan people figured that out. Kissinger liked Pinochet in Chile. The Reagan people, at the end, figured out a way to get Pinochet to stand down with autocracy and allow democratic elections in Chile in the late 1980s. So it's not a liberal globalist fetish. Support for human rights and democracy plays to America's strengths. And I'm glad that DRL survived, but I hope it's not starved and defunded.
Maybe I'll add here that Dan, Ambassador Fried, you would have been welcome to come join us in DRL at any time. So maybe there's still a chance in the future. And let me concur with Dan by giving folks some really concrete examples of what we're talking about here. The integration laterally across the State Department was perhaps annoying, but also, if done right, the best way to create a debate about challenging situations. For example, does supporting autocratic stability in the here and now potentially is making a devil's bargain that will foreclose U.S. relations in the future? That kind of question that that Dan talked about with the Shah. But let's talk about Trump's most recent policy shift, which was today in Qatar, I think, or Saudi Arabia, announcing a shift in Syria policy. Here's a perfect example. He was very clear that sanctions will be lifted. The president was very clear that he really hopes that the new Syrian government will succeed. He made the very bold move of shaking hands with someone who, had been former Al-Qaeda, a former bounty on his head. And that is the new policy. To enable this policy to succeed, we are going to need deep Syria expertise, and there is no current mission, right, in Damascus. So beyond the fact that it will all require Washington-based expertise, we will need foreign assistance. We will need to enable the new leader to create programs to bring together, the Druze and the Alawites and the other minorities, so that the new president of Syria succeeds. There is nothing on the table right now, so someone's going to have to create that program. We are going to have to lift the sanctions. That's much harder than it seems. Lifting sanctions, as Dan knows well, and some of us have done before for other countries, actually requires very careful communication with business, with other types of commercial entities, with non-governmental organizations doing business. Who's going to have the expertise to do that? There's still an e-bureau, there's still NEA, obviously, but again, the diminution of some of these skills of transitioning states, of states where you want to tread carefully as regimes change and you need to balance different sectoral and constituencies and NGO leaders, that often has required a lateral debate in the State Department between, for example, DRL, the regional bureaus, and other bureaus. And that's really worrisome that that is now being shrunk to that extent. And similarly, I also agree that there's potential in moving foreign assistance to the regionals. And yet, of course, there's no expertise to do the programming. As I think Michael mentioned, the programmatic officers need to be hired. So there is this real gap between the aspirations of synchronizing the former USAID programs with State Department and the reality that there's firing and cutting going on and other experts are fleeing. So there really needs to be a personnel and a hiring strategy that is commensurate and complements this reorg. And a lot of that personnel strategy needs to think about our embassies, because what this reorg does is it really puts a lot of emphasis and strength on the folks in the field potentially who can make big decisions. That's what the regional bureaus do, right? They represent, and they're kind of some days are the back office for the embassies, in the best possible way, in a synergetic way. But in order to do that, we need ambassadors at the embassy, and most recently we heard that the foreign service lists are being halted, right? So there doesn't seem to be a strategic sense of, if the ambition is to create greater efficiency and greater impact, how do you make this strategy come alive? And I do think that sort of calls into question the entirety. Last point I will make is that it's very worrisome that all the entities that so far DOGE and the Trump administration have targeted across state and USAID, and the rationale for the target, are exactly word for word you could find on the X accounts of folks like Bukele and Putin and Orban, right? So what do I mean? Putin and Orban have long had this misconception that USAID is sort of some sort of covert operation to overthrow regimes. As Michael and I and Dan know, nothing of the sort. The bulk of these programs are first of all, they're very transparent, but they work with governments. So there's nothing covert about it. But anyway, this suspicion and paranoia about USAID that came in the very first weeks of this administration was taken entirely from the thinking of these autocrats. And then second, this idea that there's this woke part of the State Department that is somehow running radically and imposing these ideas, including LGBTQ diplomacy. This is, again, another trope of folks. And you saw some of this even being stirred up in the recent elections in Georgia. So these are not American ideas. They're being imported and without any analysis from really folks that do not share our values and really on some level are real threats and to our country, national security threats.
And let me just add a couple of additional examples of where I think there's some downside risk, Michael, and downside risk even, and maybe especially in ways that cut against the ostensible national security strategy of the Trump administration, right? And speak to the points that Daphna and Dan made about the strategic incoherence of this reorganization and realignment process so far. In the Indo-Pacific, in Asia, where I worked at USAID over the past couple of years, we went to great pains to work closely with our colleagues at State and the Department of Defense to make sure that we had programs that supported what we called the 3D defense diplomacy development approach to national security, and to make sure that the work that we were doing, in addition to, areas where there was a pure humanitarian or moral aspect of it, was aligned with and supporting U.S. foreign policy in the region, and was supporting very, very, mindfully the posture moves that the United States was seeking to be able to pursue as we contemplate a more competitive strategic environment in the Indo-Pacific. So we worked very closely with INDOPACOM on humanitarian assistance programs and disaster response, aligned with the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement sites that allowed our rotational forces to have presence in the Philippines. All of that work on the development side is now going away. That is going to put at risk, our ability to be able to sustain posture in the Philippines. And we know from our experiences with Clark and Subic that it's not beyond the realm of imagination to think of a more challenging time in the U.S.-Filipino relationship where, that becomes a real issue again. In Vietnam, I would offer that you can draw a straight line between the work that we did on the development and foreign assistance side of the house on war legacy issues, and in particular on dioxin remediation and unexploded ordnance, and our ability to be able to open up the relationship diplomatically with the Vietnamese and get to the comprehensive strategic partnership that we signed a year and a half or so ago at this point. If we now are pulling back from all of that work, that places the comprehensive strategic partnership at risk, and that creates real problems for us as we think about what a more competitive environment in Southeast Asia looks like. Same for the Pacific Island states and the work that we were doing through the Compact of Free Association, and aligned with that, where our COFA partners made it very, very clear that the development assistance, humanitarian assistance work that USAID and our foreign assistance was able to provide was critical for them signing up to COFA and moving forward with that agreement, which gives the United States really unique military access in a strategically vital part of the world, right? So, I mean, all of that on sort of the hard power side of the equation speaks to how these different elements of U.S. foreign policy, crosshatch. And then the other point, I'll just to emphasize, the point that Ambassador Fried has been making about the importance of human rights and good governance. I would offer that if you look at where the United States has comparative advantage with authoritarian regimes, with Beijing, with Moscow, it is precisely in our ability to be able to help partners and allies and friends move forward with good governance, with free press, with vibrant civil society, with rule of law, with democracy. I mean, those are critical enablers. I mean, they're moral goods in and of themselves, but those are critical enablers for sustainable economic growth and sustainable development. Without that, it's a very, very different set of considerations as potential partners look at what we have to offer and what China, Russia, others have to offer. And so we're essentially looking now to play the game on the other team's home field with their rule set and to their advantage, as opposed to playing on our home field and with our rules to our advantage. That strikes me as a pretty fundamental mistake.
So, the conversation so far has really focused on the Trump administration and the kind of desires and plans of the executive branch. And of course, that's been a feature of these early months, a feature of the way the Trump administration has gone about dealing with the federal bureaucracy. And so, Congress has been a spectator. And there are real legal questions about congressional mandates and appropriations. And so I wonder, what now for Congress? I mean, I guess it's two questions in a sense. There's the question of what will Congress do? And then there's the other question, perhaps, of what should Congress do? Is there a way for Congress to, in a sense, mediate and perhaps try to guide this process in a way that perhaps gets us to a place that does less damage than perhaps some of the downside risks that we've discussed so far?
Well, the normal thing to do would be for Congress in an State Department authorization to mandate the continued existence of the Human Rights Bureau and to figure out some language to establish an organization within state to perform the functions of AID and figure out a way to do that so it fits with the administration's interest in giving the regional bureaus some direct input, but also brings together the functional expertise. Now, Congress can do this. The staffs are pretty good. They can come up with language which would be arguably consistent with the administration's objectives, but also have Congress keep the DOGE side of the administration away from state where they can just do wanton destruction, because they have a lot of attitude and not a lot of knowledge. So this is possible. And I think that Secretary Rubio's background as a senator probably gives him the instinct to see this and to welcome it, and it also might protect him. If he's using, I don't know this, but in his place, I would be reaching out quietly to former colleagues to help give him the backing he needs to implement his version of a reform instead of somebody else's version. I don't know that he'll do this, but he could. And the administration might see some value in this. Look, yesterday, President Trump announced a major policy shift toward Syria. It's a bold move. It's a defensible one. It could end up well. It certainly gives us an opportunity. Now, wouldn't the president like to be able to wield some tools to make it more likely that his initiative succeeds? And that could be AID, or it could be some assistance, or it could be an enterprise fund, something the U.S. came up with after the fall of the Iron Curtain. President Trump may discover that you can hate the federal bureaucracy until you're in charge, and it may produce things that you need. And the more ideological or the Bolshevik wing of the Trump administration should realize that the Foreign Service and the AID people do not actually have a left-wing socialist agenda. The underlying culture, and Daphne, as a political appointee, you probably saw this. Their agenda is to make themselves relevant by helping the administration achieve its aims and advising the administration about what makes sense and what doesn't. Because all politicals come in with some attitude, but your job is not, and I say this as a 40-year Foreign Service attitude, your job is not to tell them they're wrong. Your job is to help them succeed in a way that is possible. And that is the culture. It's not deep state plots. Just stop. And with the right leadership, the Trump people can get this from the system if they don't regard them as all potential traitors or deep state agents or whatever nonsense they've spun themselves up to believe, in an echo chamber or echo chambers, right wing, left wing, seen a lot of it. Never amounts to anything good. But this could work with the Congress, inspire the civil servants who want to be led and will respond to that kind of outreach with enthusiasm. They'll do it. So it's possible, and I see in the reorganization the potential for that if the budget cuts are not too extreme. And as I said, if the structure for assistance is maintained, and for God's sakes, they're going to have to rethink the wholesale destruction of counter disinformation capacity. It's another issue. I'll not dive down that rabbit hole now.
Yeah, no, one of the great ironies of all of this, to Ambassador Fried's point, is had the administration come in and given direction to USAID staff to, you have 6 months to come up with a report and recommendations for folding USAID into the State Department, they would have gotten a terrific report and set of recommendations on how to put USAID out of business from USAID's career staff, right? If they had treated them as allies and partners and the dedicated civil servants and patriots that they are. On the what should and what will Congress do, I think, it is hard to predict the politics of this right now. Very clearly, as Ambassador Fried spoke to, there are constitutional prerogatives and statutory authorities that the administration thus far has run roughshod over. If Congress wanted to assert itself, it has lots of cards to play in this process. I can't tell you how many hours of my life and Daphne's life, were wasted doing congressional notifications and the like that just don't seem to matter anymore, but could if Congress were to push back and assert its prerogatives. 90%, more than 90%, Daphne can correct me here if I'm screwing up the numbers, of the funding that I had available to me in the Asia Bureau at AID was congressionally directed spending. So it's not like Congress wasn't deeply engaged in the eaches of how we were conducting our foreign assistance activities and the development programs that we were supporting. And some of that language, some of that direction came from then Senator Rubio. So again, he knows how this works. He knows what where the levers are that can be pulled. And so it is easy to imagine a world in which we do have an authorization bill and an appropriations process that allows Congress to work as a co-equal branch of government with the executive to shape the future of this reorganization and realignment of the State Department and USAID, and that folds AID into the State Department in a way that takes into account, rationally and coherently the foreign policy that we're seeking to drive as a nation, right? And the only way for our foreign policy to be sustainable over time, the only way it ever has been, is when you have congressional buy-in in addition to presidential leadership. I think, unfortunately, I was trying to feel optimistic as Ambassador Fried was sort of painting that picture. We're in a world where there is a bigger game afoot that the administration is playing to create this unitary executive or potentially worse, right? And there's a reason why USAID, which lacks a deep base of domestic political support, was selected to be curb stomped to death in the first days of the administration, right? And that was, as our Chinese friends like to say, right? You killed the chicken to scare the monkeys, right? It was a demonstration effect, not just for the State Department and USAID and the foreign policy and national security parts of our government, but for the entire federal government. And it has had a real effect on morale and on people's lives. So I suspect that this question of the congressional role and congressional pushback isn't going to be resolved until the 2026 midterms, and we see whether or not there's a change in the politics and the inevitable Supreme Court cases that speak to Impoundment Act rescissions and other questions of this invitation to struggle between Congress and the executive.
So I'll just add, I guess, putting on my hat as the former director of foreign assistance, very specifically, there are two fights that we can predict will happen. And again, fight might be the wrong word because, in fact, there's clearly a three-way negotiation going on here between maybe traditionalists in the Congress of both parties when it comes to foreign aid and State Department, the Trump administrations and its supporters, and then what the sort of everyone else. But the first debate will be about the rescissions that are sent back from the State Department and USAID. When you take the approach that this administration did, which was to come in and axe off 84% of USAID and to cut, all DRL programming, et cetera, and to really take these significant budgets and just stop them midway, in addition to their real deleterious effect on the people they were helping, right? In some cases, very like life and death, an issue of life or death. In addition to the constitutional impoundment questions, there's the practical problem of returning that money to the Treasury, so it's not lost, right? So that will come in the form of rescissions, and we've never had this significant size of rescissions that will be sent back from state to Congress. So it will beg the question of whether there will be motions of disapproval, because technically the Senate and Congress can vote to disapprove of rescission, to sort of force the executive branch to use the money that is appropriated. So that will be the first back and forth negotiated debate, will be about the money that's already been appropriated. So, up 2023 money, 2024 money, 2025 money. So that will be an interesting debate. A lot of that money, frankly, will be from Ukraine, because that was the big sizable budget that was in the pipeline, and other places where there has been a consistent bipartisan consensus about, for example, funding hundreds of millions of security assistance to Jordan, or hundreds of millions of economic development to the Horn of Africa for food security. So this has been 20, 30-year bipartisan consensus on appropriations manifest in these bills that could be returned as early as this summer. So that will be the first debate. And then the second debate will be as the Congress takes up the 2026 budget. I like the idea of a state authorization. I'm not holding out hope for that bill just because it's been tried for 20 years and I see nothing about the politics of the moment that suggest it will be a priority. But the authorization questions will be taken up in the appropriation bill because it is a must-pass bill. And here, these interesting questions of where does Congress really want to fall on its sword, right? When I was director of foreign assistance, we had 460 at its highest mark earmarks from Congress. What that means, for those who are not familiar with earmarks, is an expression of one member of Congress can say, I want this, no less than this amount of money to go to Thailand to do X, to do energy projects. No less than this amount of money needs to go to Colombia to work on education. And so any member of Congress could put in an earmark, and often they would stay year in and year out, right? So there's a path dependency to those earmarks that all of us working in the Biden and Obama administration, career folks, all saw as really difficult, because in some cases the members of Congress had written that in, were no longer serving. So anyway, there's a legacy issue. So there'll be a really interesting debate of which of these 400 or 450 expressions of congressional intent will stick and which of them are relevant and new. And folks will have to really decide how to prioritize where they want to negotiate up the Trump budget. Just to remind everyone, during the first Trump term, Trump submitted a foreign assistance budget that was cut by 33% every year per the bipartisan consensus. And every single year, the Senate and House were able to restore it up to sort of traditional funding levels. And I say that because there was a sort of consistent bipartisan agreement between around the end of the Bush administration and the end of the Obama administration that the U.S. would give around 30 to 35 billion dollars in U.S. foreign assistance, U.S. aid outside the country. That's before you get into State Department, U.S. aid operations. But anyway, so that was the number. And during the Trump one, there was an attempt to cut it by 33%, and it failed. And each year, folks like Lindsey Graham and Republicans and Democrats on both sides of the aisle brought it back up to traditional levels. So we know what the traditional bipartisan consensus has been about the absolute number, and we will have to see if in the new politics of our moment and a new surge of isolationism, whether that sort of 20-year average can be matched. So that would be question number one about this budget. And then second, these individual earmarks as expressions of interest in individual countries or individual sectors like education, food security, and even security assistance in particular countries was earmarked. So we'll have to see what the current status quo is of these current members and where they want to fight.
Maybe, Michael, I'll ask you. You talked about um, a sort of coherent plan for folding AID into the State Department. And of course, this isn't a novel American thought. We've seen recently the UK fold its development organization into the FCO to make the FCDO. Are there practical lessons from those experiences, both on the kind of positive or negative side, that would inform how you would think about this? Maybe you're in terms of how you would want to see the kind of merging of development and assistance into the State Department.
Sure. I mean, I can tick off a couple of areas where I think there are lessons learned from the UK, the Canadian, the Australian, and other examples. Because again, right, this isn't a bad thought to sit down and think about whether or not our institutions are properly aligned and organized, and not at all a bad or a wrong idea to take a run at reorganization. It's just a question of whether or not you're doing it in the right way or not. And so I guess I would offer, and we've hit on some of these points already, but a lack of preparation and direction, and I think in particular the UK example was instructive on this, is really problematic. And I would argue that the lack of preparation and direction, high-level political direction, and flowing down into the bureaucracy really set them back a number of years. Secondly, you really need to be very, very mindful and thoughtful about safeguarding against the loss of expertise and technical capacity, and we've talked about that a little bit. The Australians really struggled with that. The Canadians really struggled with that. But recognizing, right, and Ambassador Fried said this earlier, I think, right, that diplomacy and development are not the same thing. They're different skill sets, different backgrounds, different experiences that people bring to the table. You want them to work in a complementary way, but not the same thing. So really focusing on, that question of expertise, technical capacity, and again, the functions and capabilities in an operational sense that you need to maintain. I think that's critical. And then lastly, I would point to the need to make sure that you are bringing the cultures together, right, which is sort of beyond just technical expertise, but bringing the different cultures together in a way that will allow both organizations and then your new organization to be able to thrive. And I think if you talk to our friends in the UK and Canada, Australia, who've gone through this sort of exercise, they all point to that as being one of the most challenging areas, but one of the most important for being able to get the new organization up and running and firing on all cylinders.
So I'm guessing this will be our kind of last round of questions. Looking at the time, we have 5 minutes left, and I should have mentioned at the outset that we received some questions in advance from hopefully people who are in attendance today that we've attempted to incorporate into the questions. But Daphne began the discussion with talking about the impact on people, and in a real world sense, some people are losing their jobs. The State Department has been the subject of a lot of discussion about morale impacting performance. Marco Rubio is not only Secretary of State, he's also dual-hatted as the National Security Advisor for the moment. Steve Witkoff has come in and assumed a lot of prominence, and I think raised some questions about where the Foreign Service officers stand, where career civil servants stand in this administration. So, at a kind of practical level, I wonder for all of you, how does this ripple through the institution, and how does it impact people there in terms of morale and their capacity to continue to do their jobs?
I was a Foreign Service officer for 40 years, and I'm not terribly interested in wringing my hands about the morale of the Foreign Service. Good Foreign Service people will figure out a way to deal constructively with their political masters. So I've never had much interest in press stories of Foreign Service officers wringing their hands or morale. The issue is how long the learning curve will be for each new administration to figure out that they actually need the help of the professionals. They always get there. There's always some turbulence along the way. And by the way, President Trump is not the first person to use personal friends to do high-level diplomacy. Sometimes that works out, and sometimes it doesn't. Roosevelt sent Joseph Davies to Moscow, who hadn't the slightest idea what Stalin was doing, completely blind. And he sent Harry Hopkins to deal with Stalin in World War II, who didn't quite get it either. And Foreign Service officer George Kennan tried to talk sense into him and didn't quite work out. My point is that Trump isn't unique, and that the Foreign Service people will figure out a way to work with their political masters. But the political appointees need to keep that learning curve fairly short and steep, because they're going to need the help of the pros. And they're going to find out, usually the hard way, that their assumptions, sometimes sound, sometimes fatuous, about the way things work or ought to work, are not going to be borne out. Now, it is possible that this administration is only its version of this more regular learning curve. Now, I get there are a whole lot of other things the administration is doing that are not defensible, and I'm a critic of some of its policies in the foreign affairs area. Okay, I get that. But I don't worry about morale per se. I do worry about people being fired for no good reason, or worse, people being fired in a performative manner. And I know, I won't specify, but I know of some cases where political appointees took glee, personal satisfaction in firing people, as if this was a righteous act of the people's vengeance against the ideological enemy. That's cruel. It's also really dumb, because it suggests that they believe their own hype and sense of righteousness. And anybody who believes that is setting themselves up and setting the president up for a fall. So my answer is a slightly different take on the morale issue. It's not simply coddling the Foreign Service, it's recognizing that you need professionals. That you don't want a bunch of political appointees making decisions about war fighting without some actual military officers telling you what works and what doesn't.
I would just add that, I know we're out of time. There's another part of this that we haven't mentioned. We've talked about the morale in Washington. By stopping so much foreign assistance, we're actually creating more isolationism for America in very practical ways, which is the whole implementing mechanism of foreign assistance relies on hundreds and thousands of local nationals. And these people start, in their 20s working for USAID programs, and then they start their own NGOs, and then they become ministers of finance, and then they become prime ministers. I mean, not all of them, obviously, but these are networks of contacts. And so we just fired a bunch of people who could be future ministers in many countries around the world. And that's not great for our long-term standing. But second, in the short term, this is very inefficient for US foreign policy and really damaging because these are the people who tell us what's going on, right? And they don't do it in a quid pro quo way, but this is how we learn. I mean, again, this is not some covert collection of information, but this is how diplomats get to know what's going on in a country is they have networks of people. And so what I worry about is that the quality of our information coming in is going to be incredibly narrowed. And it's going to be easier to trust the Orban tweets and the Bukele tweets and the Putin tweets about what's going on in the world because we're not going to have information and counter information in our ecosystems. And we've been trying for 20 years since 9/11 to balance security for our diplomats and not having them behind these big fortresses with enabling them to do their job, which is to get out and figure out what's going on and be part of society, the economy, the security questions of the day. And we have just really impeded our ability to do so and limited our diplomats' ability to do their job.
I will be very, very quick because I know we're a couple of minutes over time. I think my concern is less on the political appointee career side of the fence as well, right? That's a tale as old as time, and that will play out as it plays out. But I think of for example, the disaster response team that we sent into Burma following the earthquake a couple of months ago, who were fired while they were on the ground in Burma and Myanmar doing the disaster response. Right? That's not great for morale. And it's that sort of effect, the way in which this administration is going about this process that is just sapping the will and the ability, particularly on the foreign assistance side of the house, of staff, both the American staff and Daphna's very good point about the Foreign Service national and locally employed staff to do their work, particularly when it's in an environment where the value of the work is being routinely, I'll steal Ambassador Freed's word, and gleefully denigrated, right? People are drawn to work in development and foreign assistance and humanitarian affairs because they see it as a calling. They see the work, and the same with with our foreign service officers at the State Department. This is something that is valuable and that speaks to their values as people. And it's hard when that's getting trashed and the entire ecosystem in which you work is being wiped out, to come into the office in the morning in the best possible mindset and with the best possible energy and motivation to do your job.
Well, thanks for sticking with us a few minutes over, and thanks to the panelists for a really great discussion. And my thanks to the Reese Center and Just Security, and look forward to doing this another time. Thank you.